The purpose of this video is to demonstrate how SQLite database is created from within the Unity environment using the SQLite library that was provided in class. A thing to note is that SQLite databases inside the editing environment are stored in a folder called Streaming Assets. At this point, I've deleted the contents of that. So now I'm going to run the game from scratch. Okay, so the game from scratch is sitting inside Unity Editor, and I will run it. So that's now run, and you'll notice down here at the bottom it's got a final path indicating where the database was created. It's over here that a file called setup.db has been created. This is a SQLite database. I'll stop the game and we'll see that this will produce eventually a meta file, which is used by the editor to keep track of files that it's working on. So between the run and getting to the login, the system has checked if the database exists and created tables and created information that represents the game story in the story manager. It's also created a table that contains the player information and potentially player items. So that information is described in model tables that have a specific shape. They're cut back representations of information that you're interested in your game. So here we have the player. Studio environment, and the player has an ID, a name, password, and the current scene. You can also see that we have a scene here. So the scene has an ID, a story. So potentially each scene could come from a story. We also have items. So here's an item with some thoughts about effects. In this particular system, the doors between scenes are represented by scene directions. So we can go from one scene to another with a scene direction. The label potentially represents a direction label, for example, north, south, east, or west. We also have a story which keeps track of how many different stories we've got in our system. And we have a scene item which stores items for a scene in a relational manner. We have inventory items, which stores information about a player and their items, so it's called an inventory item. So all these are going to be represented as tables in the database, and the system's going to automatically create those tables for us. Those tables are created by the story manager. So go down to the bottom here. The story manager uses a method that's part of the data service object to create inventory items, players, scene directions, scene items, scenes, and stories. So that statement there asks the database system to make those tables. If the tables already exist, it doesn't override them. It just says, yep, I've got those already. The thing that happens here is then if it's got a story, it then makes a story. So if it doesn't have a story, it makes a story, otherwise it gets a story. So just a quick look at make story. So make story just checks to see if there's a story, connects to the database, grabs a story. Then it builds a series of scenes. So we have a forest scene, and it inserts a story for that. It inserts the forest. We have a mall scene. Made some items, and then the items are inserted into the items, into an items list. Sorry, the items are inserted according to the list of items that we got. So we're inserting each item into the database, and we're making a connection between the item and the scene. And then it's creating a cliff, and then it's creating directions for each one. So if you're trying to see how to store information on the SQLite, this is quite a good place to look. So there is also a get story method. All right, so how does this work and what's going to happen? So I'm going to put a stop on the game model object. Now the game model object is being used to keep track of information between the Unity game scenes. It's a static class. It gets constructed when it's needed. So the game model keeps track of the story manager and the player manager. And anytime we want to deal with the story, we go to the game model, or we want to deal with the player, we go to the player manager. So the game model probably in this version gets instantiated by having a reference to game manager to the game model. So game manager is a component that keeps track of game information and state as well, but just for the current scene and current set of displays. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to attach it to Unity, and I'm going to get the system to stop when it goes to the story manager, which I've done here. And then we're going to look at what happens and how that creates the database and the tables for the database. So notice I've got these here, which I don't want to have in. So I'm going to stop the whole lot, and then I'm going to start again when this is cleared. So one thing to be very cautious with is that, especially since Visual Studio has been introduced as the main editor for Unity, that editing files that are in the middle of being used can create problems and muck up Visual Studio and muck up the Unity environment, the way it's communicated. So right now I'm deleting these files, and I'm going to start the Unity environment again and the Visual Studio environment again, and attach it to that environment. Attach the Visual Studio to that environment. Okay, so I'll just check that I've got my stops in place, the ones I want to see from the game model. And game model is making a story manager, so that's a good thing. And that will be a good start as far as how the system makes the database. So I'll attach that to Unity. Okay. So note that these are pretty much domain based classes. I suppose if I had a particular theme for my game, then these should actually be more about that. So if this was actually meant to be a horror thing, then perhaps my scenes might be terror story or something like that, or terror event, and items within that would be terror items. My player might be an adventurer instead of a player, and my inventory items could be, for example, Ghostbuster weapons or something like that. Right, so I'm ignoring this for the moment, but I think it'll be fine. I think it'll be all right. Okay, so I'm going to start the system. Here we go. So I've got my game manager doing something. I'm going to leave that now, and I want to see if my game model actually gets hit. So to continue, and there we go. Finally, my game model got instantiated, and it's making a new story manager. So we're going to continue into there. I think I've got stops in the right place. Okay, so the first thing it's doing is making this data service, and the data service is constructing the file location and then making a SQLite request to create the database, or open it read write. If the database already exists, it won't. It will not try to make it again. So it's done that. Then we get this connection object. I'm going to step over, and that becomes the connection object that we can access from our system, this one here, from the data service. So data service is a separate class that does things for us that we can add our methods to bridge between our game and our SQLite. So here's one that creates tables based on their types. There's a store if not exist, store all if not exists. I've got an insert scenes, which I've not done at the moment. I was going to generate scenes at some point. So now I'll go back to that story manager, and we'll just continue. And the next thing that happens is that the story gets made. So it's made of databases. I'm just going to make stories. I'm going to pop over these. It's making the stories, and we're going to go down through a stop. The debugging doesn't work that well with these, some people call them arrow functions, I call them lambda functions, because the actual code that gets generated is somewhat different from what you see here. I'm going to go up to here. So I made a story, and then I'm making a scene. Here's my scene. This is like a piece of data that I'm using my system. I'm inserting it into the appropriate database. Now this insert just happens to know that that's a forest record, and it inserts it into the forest table. That's how it works in the system. So I'm going to step over, and I'm getting myself a forest ID, and I'm saying the first story location is a forest. Then I'm updating my story, and I'm making it mall, and I'm doing the same sort of thing again. I'm going to make sure I've got a mall ID. These are being used to connect things together. I'm making a set of items. I'm going to make a list first, and then that list will be used to insert stuff into the database. So here I'm using a where clause on the list. This, by the way, only works if you've included the link library into your system. So this one here will go and add an item to the database, and then it's going to add a scene item once it's got that item to indicate that that item is in that scene. So the current scene is mall, and we're adding a list of things there. I'll step over, and I'm going to actually step over again, and we're doing, this is the cliff, and it inserts a cliff record. And in this game, in this system, I'm using scene direction to connect things together. So here we've got the from scene, to scene, and the direction that it's in. So we step over that, and that will make our database and the records to go in the database, and then this will make the database connections in the scene direction table, or the list of connections between scenes in the scene list table. So at that point, that's built everything that we were interested in. So the next question would be, well, how do I use that in my game? Well, the story manager keeps track of the first scene, and that should be connected to the first scene to display it in very much the same way that the earlier ones were. In your case, you might actually have the story manager grabbing information that you need when you go to the appropriate scene. So there is the story about stories and how they get made in this example.